along the lines of some other non-quarterback discussions, I thought it might be a time to kind of take a look at, okay, so we're talking about, the quarterbacks that need to step up, guys that need to develop. We've talked about Brandon Ayuk and his, cryptic messages about his future in San Francisco and who needs to step up on and the wide receiver and the position groups. So I think you can kind of go a lot of different ways with this next question that we want to pose, which is which non-quarterback has to take the next step this offseason? I have a few different names that come to mind, and kind of like our last question, I found it a little bit difficult to decide on one, but I'm curious what you think about this.
The first one that came to mind for me is a guy you already mentioned on our last segment about open positions. It's the at the corner spot, and it's Diamador Lenore for me. If he has a great offseason and steps up and kind of transforms Evan, that answers a ton of questions for the 49ers this offseason, because everything you laid out just a little bit ago, and if this is the first segment you're listening to here on the 415ers, I would suggest going back, finding our other segment and listening to that one first, and then coming back here to this one. Everything you laid out is 100% right. Diamador Lenore did a fair job filling in for the injured Emmanuel Mosley. But if he takes the next step forward and is a legitimate starting corner, not a number one corner, you have Mooney Ward, but as a legitimate starting corner, and not the nickel corner, not the slot guy, a legitimate starting corner for this Niners defense, it makes everything so much easier for them to kind of figure out and to fit the remaining puzzle pieces together. If you already have two solid corners that you believe in, everything else becomes 10 times easier. So I think for me, when you look at the defense right now, you already talked about it. Where is that weakness? Where are the questions? It's that second cornerback spot right now. If Diamador Lenore has a fantastic offseason heading into year number 3 and suddenly becomes, a solid number 2 corner for this Niners defense, everything becomes easier. So I think for me, that's number one. If he has a gigantic offseason for the 49ers, their issues become extremely minimized suddenly.
Yeah, especially with how much better their defensive line is probably going to be with the addition of Hargrave. There's going to be even less time for quarterbacks to get that ball out. And so if Lenore can just lock things up for 2.5, 3 seconds,
Yeah.
that's going to be huge. I'm with you to an extent, and I want to first explain my thought process before I get into who I think should be my guy. And I hear you on Lenore. I also think you could look at McKivitz. You could look at Brendel, guys that are slated for starting spot they maybe had at certain points last year. And I hope that they prove me wrong, but my doubt in those three players means that I cannot slot them into this conversation because I just don't think there's much of a ceiling for those guys. Again, I'm hope that I'm wrong, but I think that we're going to see all three of those guys at different points this next year become a little bit exposed. My pick for this is still in the secondary, and it might shock you, it might not. It's Talanoa Hufanga.
Oh,
There is a major void left in the secondary by Jimmy Ward and his veteran leadership being the most previously tenured 49er now being gone. I know that they re-signed to Sean Gibson, who was good for them last year and was a big reason that Jimmy Ward had to move to the slot. But Hufanga, it's going to be his third season. I think there's still a ceiling even more so that he can reach. And he was a first-team All-Pro safety last year. He was very good. But he also was a bit of a center fielder, and that got him beat at times. I think he gave up 6 or 7 touchdowns in the passing game. I think there's room for improvement there. I think he's already great in the box. I think he's a heat-seeking missile. But I think that as far as leadership off the field and on it, of course, as well as being better in pass coverage, are areas that Talanoa Hufanga can realistically take the next step in this offseason. And I think that those areas will also help guys like Diamador Lenore, as well as whoever's in the slot, because he'll be so much better in the secondary, being able to move those chess pieces. You already got Fred Warner. You already got a dominant defensive line. So you got quarterbacks in the middle and up front, but you need that guy on the back end. And I think Hufanga can take the next step in that sense to be that guy next season.
I think your point about leadership in that secondary is big. I mean, you're not lacking leadership on the defense in general. Fred Warner is as good as it comes. Nick Bosa, while he is more reserved, I mean, what we learned about him giving a lot of the pregame and locker room speeches this season. He does leadership maybe a little differently than some other guys, but he's certainly a leader defensively. But specifically on the secondary, you're right. I mean, 2 years ago, they had Jaquaski Tart and Jimmy Ward as the starting safeties, both very long 49ers. Of course, Jaquaski Tart moved on after 2 seasons ago, not this most recent season, but the one before that. And now Jimmy Ward with the Houston Texans. And suddenly, you're right, there is kind of a lack of 49er experience in the defensive secondary. You have Gibson, a 1-year 49er. You have Mooney Ward, a 1-year entering second year for both those guys, 49er. You have Diamador Lenore, as we talked about, entering his third year, and Talanoa Hufanga entering his third year. So you're totally right. Maybe it's a little less on-field play because, as you mentioned, he was already great. There's still room to improve. But it's more so kind of um, taking over that leadership mantle that Jimmy Ward had held for such a long time. In the secondary, that's really important. So I like that. That's a good one.
Yeah, I also think, and look, it's not a guy who needs to take a step up, but I think he needs to, perhaps try and find a way to recapture what he had 2 seasons ago, and that might be Debo Samuel. I know he
Mm.
was banged up a lot this year, and that allowed for a guy like Brandon Ayuk to take center stage. Of course, Christian McCaffrey played a big part in that. But if Debo Samuel is going to live up to the contract that he signed last offseason, I am gonna need to see more out of him. And we've talked a lot about the decisions that the 49ers will have to make at the wide receiver spot and whether that includes Debo Samuel in the future. So, maybe it's not just him stepping up to, of course, help the 49ers, help them win and ideally capture a Super Bowl next year, but also potentially keep his spot. So I think that might be one to keep an eye on as well.
Well, it's funny you brought that up because before we did wrap this up, I was going to hit you with one that I
Okay.
thought might be coming a little bit out of left field. Um, Danny Gray. This might be like a year ahead. Again, we've talked
Okay.
about this. But
Yeah.
let's say Danny Gray has a great offseason.
Hmm.
Not necessarily going to get a ton of snaps this year, you would imagine, but he's going to be featured. If he has a
He can
great
fly.
offseason, he can fly. He can take the top off the defense. And that's kind of the one receiver the Niners don't have right now. Let's say he has a great offseason. That I think gives the 49ers the extra little oomph, the extra confidence, the extra push to make them be okay with pulling the trigger on a big move in the wide receiver room. Because we've talked about it. Debo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, the contract numbers, it's going to become an issue at some point. A year from now is when the Niners will really have to make a decision about it. But a good offseason followed by a good actual season from Danny Gray, Evan, I think will put the Niners' mind at ease regarding that decision on Ayuk and Debo a year from now. So while I'm probably getting a little bit too in the weeds, I think this is a big offseason for Danny Gray from the perspective of the 49ers' future planning purposes. If Danny Gray has a terrible offseason and they see zero improvement and they feel the need to go out and get someone out in the draft, and maybe that doesn't work out either. I don't know. It just could make their decision when it comes to, those contracts, it could make it a little more difficult. But Danny Gray, with solid progression this offseason, with some, showings in the regular season, I think makes that decision a little bit easier. So, excuse me, I hit my mic there. Maybe I'm getting a little bit too into it here, but a Danny Gray offseason turnaround, I think could work wonders for the 49ers as well.
Yeah, no, I really like Danny Gray, and I was a bit perplexed as to why we couldn't see him more on the field, especially at the beginning of last season. And who knows that there was a lot of different shuffling with quarterbacks, and Danny Gray's strength is perhaps Trey Lance's, but not really Jimmy Garoppolo's when it comes to arm strength, and maybe not Brock. I'm honestly not sure, but I'm with you that I expect to see and hear more about Danny Gray. I'm not sure if it'll translate down the line, but it's
Yeah.
something to keep note of. Absolutely. I also do think, the 49ers have 11 draft picks this year. So we've already established offensive line. We've already, I think they've taken a tight end. I also wouldn't be surprised, and maybe this is where we can start our next episode, where we think those third round picks are going,
Hmm.
because Dorian Thompson-Robinson could project to be more of a fifth, sixth, or seventh type of quarterback the 49ers could take a chance on. But I do think next episode we can take a look at where the 49ers will prioritize and perhaps throw a couple names out there, make some predictions, some declarations.
Hmm.
I'm looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. We'll have to do some deep dive research on our big boards, getting ready for the draft here coming up for next episode. Because what you're probably listening to this on Thursday. The draft is 2 weeks away. Get ready.
Yeah, my draft board's probably going to look a lot like this. For those listening, it's kind of just a scribble in the background, a lot of different lines going in different directions awkwardly. That's probably what my draft board's going to look like in 2 weeks.
Fair enough. You'll be able to get some takes out of it though. You'll figure it out. I
Exactly.
trust
Yeah, a
you.
lot of different names, a lot of different directions, and 2 episodes a week. That's what we got coming your way in the 415ers podcast. So we appreciate you tuning into this Thursday's episode as you're listening. We'll talk to you next Tuesday. That's Marc Grandi. I'm Evan Giddings saying so long. It's been the 415ers on the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network. We'll talk to you next time.